Okay, so I'm here to give a talk about Globus. I'm going to give the kind of Globus in a nutshell, kind of a Globus intro. How many people here have used Globus, are familiar with Globus? Okay, so about half, good. So an intro talk is probably pretty good here. So I'm Greg Nawrocki, I'm with the Globus team. The Globus, we're actually a department at the University of Chicago. I'm also dual appointed at Argonne National Laboratory, so lots of different ways to get a hold of me. And yeah, so let's carry on here. So Globus, we're a nonprofit service. We're developed and operated by the University of Chicago. I mentioned that we are a department within the University of Chicago. And this is our mission. I won't read it verbatim, but the key word here is sustainable, right? Sustainability. So Globus, a long time ago, was developed with a lot of grant funding, and we still do have some grant funding. However, you know, it's tough for me to come to you and say, hey, use Globus, we're going to be here forever. It's going to be a great way to transfer data and manage your research data. But, you know, if our grant dries up, we won't be there. So we developed the sustainability model, and really what we rely on here is subscriptions from our subscribers. The University of Chicago itself is one. Argonne is, of course, one. We can talk about that in a minute. But as I mentioned, a lot of our development is still grant-based, so you know, thank you to our sponsors there. But our ongoing operations is funded by our subscribers, and I'll talk a little bit about the subscription model and what that means as we go on, and if you're a subscriber and if you aren't, and what you can and can't do. But most of the national laboratories are subscribers. Most of the R1s are the Carnegie class R1s are subscribers, so we do have a lot of subscribers out there supporting us and getting us. I believe we just passed that sustainability mark, so we are fully sustainable with our subscriber funding. So I can show you all sorts of different stats on Globus and talk about that, but I would be remiss if I didn't show this. I pulled that down the other day on our globus.org website. There's a counter that flips with how much data we've transferred. And so as of yesterday, we're well over 1.6 exabytes of data that Globus has transferred. So certainly something that has stood the test of time. So this is one slide I will read verbatim because it's kind of important. And Globus delivers fast and reliable data transfer. I crossed out big here because, you know, what about those large collections of small files or files that you need to make sure get from point A to point B reliably and securely? You know, Globus is really good for that as well. We're, of course, always known as the big data transfer guys, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means. Sharing, I'll touch on sharing and how that works. Our platform services, how you can build upon Globus to do kind of your own thing. Directly from your own storage systems. We're not a storage provider. We're a bring your own storage model. We do have some connectors for cloud-based storage systems. I'll talk about that as well. Via software as a service, we've got a nice web-based interface, and I'll demo that. And then, of course, our platform services, which I'll talk about. Using your existing identities, we're not an identity provider. We want you to be able to use those existing identities that you have at your universities or your national laboratories or even your Google accounts. All with this overarching goal of unifying access to data across all tiers. So what does that mean? That means we make every type of storage system, whether it's your standard POSIX storage, whether it's object stores, whether it's cloud-based storage, our tape archives, it doesn't matter. We're going to make it look like one thing, and that's a Globus collection. And I'll talk a little bit about what a Globus collection means. So that's handy, especially when you're in our web browser, in our web app, but it's also handy when you're trying to do automation because everything is just a Globus collection to us. You can use our service to access that and the various aspects to access our service to make those automation tasks happen. Okay. Oh, and feel free to interrupt me at any time too. I'm fine doing that. If you've got a question, you want me to dive deeper on something, I've got no problem with that. So let's talk a little bit about the Globus connectors, our ways of connecting to various storage. We have premium connectors to talk to just about every type of storage out there, including the major cloud-based storage systems. The one that isn't listed there is Dropbox. However, we're considering working on a connector for that. But certainly just about every type of storage system out there, you can configure Globus to access. Okay, so I'll tie it all up in one slide here, and then I will pause, and I'll pause for some questions, and then do a couple more slides, and we'll jump into a demo. Okay, so Globus in one slide. When we talk about Globus, we talk about three things: transfer, sharing, and then building upon those with our platform services. So the transfer model here. In this example, we've got a researcher here, and she's got Globus on an instrument. So you'll see Globus Connect here. Globus Connect is, that's what creates an endpoint, what creates a collection on your storage system. So this instrument happens to be a Globus endpoint. And she's able to transfer between that and her compute facility because, again, endpoint collection. She can transfer between those two. So simple transfer is something you don't even need a subscription to do. You could do this without a subscription as long as you have the ability to authenticate to both of those endpoints, both of those collections. You can do transfers with no subscription required. So here we go. She fires off a transfer. It could be from the web browser, could be from the command line interface, could be automated. Doesn't matter. Globus is fire and forget, right? She can fire this off, and this transfer could take days, weeks, months. She doesn't have to worry about it. She can log out, log back into the browser. Globus is going to babysit that connection and transfer those files reliably and securely. Okay, reliably in the sense that if the connection glitches, we're going to pick up right where it left off. It's not like SCP where if the connection dies, you got to start it all over. Let's see, reliably in the sense that we do checksumming, so what you see is what you get. If the file that was transferred doesn't match, we're going to transfer it again. Reliably in the sense that we use a protocol called grid FTP, so it's very fast. In an optimized network, it gets you roughly 20 times SCP performance, and it's a tunable protocol. Securely, this could be an encrypted channel. You have the ability to force encryption at the endpoints as well. So a great way for simple transfer. Okay, so now she's got those files up to her compute facility, and this is where she wants to share it out. She wants to share it with a colleague at another institution. That colleague doesn't have an account on this compute facility. So how does she go about that? This is where the subscription comes into play. Luckily, her institution is a Globus subscriber, so she can create a Globus share, what we call guest collections. And what she does is she's going to select a set of files, set a directory, and say, I want to share this with this other Globus user. Doesn't even have to be at her institution. And Globus is going to control access to those files. I'll talk a little bit about how we do that in our hybrid SaaS model. And there's no need to kind of do that double hop. Usually with sharing, people shove it up to cloud storage and then somebody has to pull it down. That double hop can be expensive both in storage costs and just expensive in time, especially with the size of files that we as researchers deal with. Okay, so this collaborator is going to log in, and because Globus controls access, they don't need a local account to access that. They've been granted that access by that researcher, and they can grab that file and transfer it to their own endpoint, their own collection here. I'll talk a little bit about how to create your own collections. We've got a really handy Globus Connect Personal. In fact, I'll do an install of that and show you how easy it is to get that up and running. Okay, so, and I say download here, it's really transfer. We do now in Globus Connect Server version 5 have the ability to do HTTPS downloads. So if this person can't or won't install Globus Connect, they have the ability to download the files with HTTPS. You don't get grid FTP with that, so you don't get all that grid FTP goodness. So if you've got a large file and the connection glitches, game over, you gotta start it again. Okay, lastly, building upon this, and this is just using, and I'll talk about these briefly, our timer services, our automation services. We've got a command line interface. We've got our API sets. We've got an SDK that wraps those. All these tools that you can use to build science gateways, portals, access Globus within the construct of Jupyter Notebooks, a Jupyter Hub. You can create your own code, whatever. And this, so you can automate your research workflows, ensure those that really, need access to the data have it, all from the comfort of your web browser or using those platform services. accessing just about any type of storage out there. You saw all the various connectors that we have, and using your existing identities. You don't need a special Globus account to do this. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about our hybrid SaaS model and mapped collections, just being able to do a simple transfer. So Globus Connect, this is software that you install, software that you create and instantiate an endpoint and instantiate collections. Right, so that's you install. Now we've got our Globus services that are up in AWS, and that's what you're going to log into, what you're going to access with your web browser. And when I do the demo, this will all become clear to those that have never used Globus before. So Globus is the orchestrator of the transfer, right? It uses a control channel to tell these endpoints, okay, start transferring this data from this endpoint to that endpoint. The transfer happens, the data channel is directly between the two endpoints. It doesn't flow through our service. We never see those files. We never see what the data that's being transferred. So we're completely oblivious to the data, except for we do keep file and path information because we need that when we're doing the transfer to ensure that it happens reliably. Okay, so in that sharing model, the guest collection model, this is where that external user came in and authenticated through the Globus services and was able to access that managed endpoint. Managed endpoint is simply a Globus term for I hereby bless this endpoint under a subscription, and therefore I can create guest collections, and was able to access that guest collection that was specially set up for them to then do that data transfer to an endpoint of their own being, of their own ownership. And in this case, it's Globus. This should probably say Globus Connect Personal here, because it's on their laptop, and they can transfer that directly between their two endpoints to their two collections. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Globus, the core security features of Globus. Your own IDP, right? Access control is managed by your institution. So you control all this access policy. Somebody leaves the institution, their identity goes away, their access to those Globus collections goes away. The data, you saw how the data stays at the institution, right? You don't have to fire it up to a cloud service and then have somebody bring it down. We don't store it. We don't even see it. It doesn't flow through our service, but directly between those endpoints and collections. So a very secure method of data transfer. Integrity checks to transfer data. This is the checksumming, right? What you see is what you get. The high availability and redundancy we're in multiple exclusion zones in a virtual private cloud in AWS. Very, very reliable. And also, you can enforce the encryption of that data transfer. So you can make sure that the transition is always secure, no matter who's accessing it and no matter how, the level of their ability. Okay, let's talk a little bit about that component that you install locally on your machine. There's two versions of Globus Connect, two versions of the thing that makes an endpoint, that makes a collection. One is Globus Connect Server, and that's installed on the multi-user Linux system. So I'll access Theta, right? Theta is where Globus Connect Server is running, the multi-user. You can access your home directory structure there. And then Globus Connect Personal. You can actually turn your local laptop, your workstation, into a Globus collection or endpoint. Very simple to install, and I'll do a demo of that. Okay, so I'll jump into a demo unless there's any questions, because what could go wrong? Yeah.
Sure. So in the previous slide, you mentioned redundancy. Why Globus needs that redundancy when you are not keeping any data at your end? It's on those facilities, right?
Well, you certainly want our service to be redundant, right? You don't want to go to log into Globus and we're not there, right? So the service is, oops, I'm going backwards there. The Globus service, you're going to want to be able to access that in order to manipulate the connections between your endpoints. So that's what's redundant from our side.
And let's say I have one directory and it contains like maybe millions of files, but I want to open to the guest only a few files.
Yeah.
So can I do that?
You can share per file or you can share per directory, yeah.
So I cannot do partially?
No. Okay, yeah, so let's jump in here to a quick demo. Okay, so it all starts, let me make this a little bit bigger because that's going to be tough to see. Okay, that should be pretty good. It all starts here from globus.org. If you click login, it's going to take you to app.globus.org, and this is where you can authenticate. Let me make that a little bit bigger again. Okay, so lots of different ways to authenticate to log into Globus. And you know, I mentioned using your home IDPs. So there's a list of here of probably 1,000 or so identity providers that you can use to log into Globus. You can use your ALCF identity, your Argonne identity, whatever you want. I'm going to use my University of Chicago identity here. Let's type Chicago. And there we go. I'm going to use my University of Chicago identity to log in. If I scroll down here, you could sign in with your Google identity. If you got an ORCID, you could sign in with that. We do have our own lightweight identity provider. If all else fails, you can go get yourself a Globus ID and use that to log into Globus. Okay, like I said, at the University of Chicago, I'm going to use my UChicago identity. And here we go. It's going to take me out to my UChicago SHIB server, and I, of course, don't ever remember anything here. Oops. And let's get my UChicago account. Where am I here? Oh, wait, it did save it. There we go. Okay, so I'm logging in to the SHIB server at University of Chicago. We honor multi-factor authentication. So yeah, this is the part of the demo where I realized I left my phone in the car. Fortunately, I have it here. So here we go. I'm going to enter my passcode, and I'll do login. Okay, cool. So there we go. So I just authenticated to Globus, and I'm logged in. This is the single pane view. I'm showing one endpoint, one collection. I generally like to use the dual pane view because then I can see both collections that I'm transferring to or from. I hope that's visible there. Yeah, okay. So authenticated to Globus, and I've got my dual pane view. So let's go to an endpoint. I'm going to go to Midway. So our cluster at the University of Chicago is UChicago RCC Midway. And because I use my UChicago credentials to authenticate, there we go. This is my home directory structure at on Midway. So I could, you know, if I shelled into Midway, this is what I'd see. So let's go to another endpoint, and I will go to Theta. Right? So I'm going to log into Theta here, and I was just authenticated to Theta because I was doing some transfers, so that's why it allowed me here. But normally I was kind of hoping it'd show the workflow where it says, okay, that's great, Greg Nawrocki at uchicago.org. I don't know who you are. I need you to authenticate here, and it would have forced me to do that. But since I was just using it, it didn't do that. So let's go ahead and transfer a file. I click on, I'm going to just transfer this little 1 meg file. I'm going to click on that, and then I am going to hit the start button, and away it goes. So the transfer takes off. You see the transfer request submitted here. I can view details on that. I can drill into the event log. Obviously a small file, so it's going to start, progress, and succeed very quickly. But I could look at fault events. If the network's glitching, I can see what's going on here. If maybe one of the endpoints, one of the collections was taken down by the manager of it momentarily, I could see that. So I can get a whole lot of information on my transfer. Okay, so let's go back to that file manager. And let's dig in a little bit more. I'm going to transfer a little bit bigger file here, this 10 gig file. And you'll notice there's some transfer and timer options here. I can label the transfer. Let's give it Greg's 10 gig. You can see I've done that before. So I'm going to label that transfer. This is advantageous. So if you've got a bunch of transfers going on and you want to log out and log back in and look at the activity monitor, which I'll show in a minute, you can pick those transfers out. So there's other settings that you can follow. You can sync. Only change your new files where the checksum's different, where a file doesn't exist on the destination. Lots of different ways to skin this cat. And this is the example of doing a backup or a replication task with Globus. Again, you can delete files on the destination that don't exist on the source. Again, kind of backup and replication. Preserve the source file modification times, right? Who cares when it was transferred? I want to know when it was last touched. You can actually turn off the checksumming if that's taking a great deal of time. If you got large files, sometimes it's advantageous to turn that off. You can select encryption of the transfer. If one of these endpoints said, I am forcing you to encrypt the transfer, it would be checked and grayed out. I wouldn't be able to turn that off. Skip files on the source with errors. If you've got a bunch of files, what we'll do is if a file errors out, we just keep pounding on it and we're going to make sure it transfers. But if you want to skip that, you can. Again, failing on quota errors, similar. If you start filling up your disk, we're just going to keep trying until somebody gives you some more quota. And likely they won't, so you might want to check that box too. So, okay, so there we go. So there's our transfer and timer options. Oh, the timer. We've got the ability to do repetitive tasks. You can set up timers for transfers in the future. You can set up timers for multiple transfers, lots of different ways to use our timer service, and I'll touch on that when I talk a little bit about the timer service. But yeah.
I don't know if this is asked, but is there like a version control where you can see, like, say you put something there and then you change?
Oh, and if it was newer, you could do, let's see, if you're syncing, yeah, you wouldn't really be able to do that. Yeah, I mean, you could do it on file size being different, but then, yeah, I mean, you're going to just transfer the newer file. Yep. Yeah, so we don't, we don't really see that far into the file system. Okay, so let's light that off, and away that transfer goes. So, here you can log out, log back in, check on it, and you could go to your activity monitor here, and you say, see, I have a transfer going, and there's that Greg's 10 gig transfer with the task queued. If I click on that, I can get some additional information on that. Look at the event log, task has started, so it will be transferring as I go on between Theta and Midway at the University of Chicago. Okay, so that's the simple transfer model. Let's talk a little bit about sharing and showing sharing. I'm going to do that from Midway, from U Chicago. It's a little bit different, so you can't do it from Theta, but you can do it from Eagle, and I'll talk a little bit about how that's done from Eagle after this, but the more common way I'll show you is the way it's done on Midway here. And let's see, let's go to collection here. Oh, so it looks like that finished. So I can dig into the activity monitor. Here's that 10 gig file I just transferred. Gives you some stats on it, pretty good effective speed there between Theta and the University of Chicago, as one would expect. I look at the event log, nothing out of the ordinary here. Started, progressed, and succeeded, so nothing crazy there. Okay, let's go back here in the sharing model. So I've got my slides from today that I've put in a Globus slide download, this directory. There's my Globus intro slides that you probably pulled off of Slack, but you could also pull them off of here. Not yet, but soon. Okay, so let's go back to that Globus slides directory, and I want to turn this into a share, or a Globus guest collection. So I'm going to highlight that and click on share, and I'm going to add a shared endpoint. You'll hear kind of there's a little bit of a dichotomy here with the way that endpoint and collection is used. Back in the pre-Globus Connect Server version 5, endpoint and collection were the same thing. It's separated out a little bit, but if you're wondering why there's that kind of crossover in the web app, that's why. There's still a lot of Globus Connect Server version 4s out there. So let's see, let's give it a share name, Greg's ATPESC 2022 share. Okay, I can give it a description and keywords. That way, if somebody's trying to discover it, is searching on it, not only will they be able to search on the display name, but also the description and any keywords in there. Won't do that now. And let's go ahead and create that share. So great, so the share's done. I can now share this out with users at different institutions. So yeah, so I'm only halfway there though, right? Because I've got the share created. Now I've got to actually share with somebody. So I'm going to add permissions, and I'm going to share with, I've got my alter ego here, Nawrocki Personal. And this is a Globus ID there. And I could send my personal self an email. Here are the files. And I actually want to tie this down because I don't want this other person to have access to my entire share. I just want to have them to have access to a specific directory. So slide download that directory and select that. And kind of the model here is, you could create one guest collection and then have multiple directories per individual and then share things per individual there. So that's kind of the model that you can think of. Oh, you can give, in this case, I'm only going to give read permissions, but you could also give write permissions if you wanted somebody to be able to push data up. And let's go ahead and add that permission. Okay, great. So this Nawrocki personal character should have the ability to access UChicago Midway. And I will do that here. I'm going to pull up a new browser. And let's log in. Oops, it's going to probably go to a collection account I don't want. Yep, that's not the account I want. In, I'm going to use a Globus ID here to log in. I want Nawrocki Personal, that one. There we go. Okay, and let's make that a little bit bigger. Okay, so now I am on my Nawrocki Personal Globus account here. And if I look here, I can prove that hit accounts. So I've got no UChicago accounts linked in. This person should not have any right to access Midway. But if I look here and I go to collections, shared with me, I see that there's my share from today. I click on that, open that in the file manager, and sure enough, in that slide download directory, I can see that file on Midway. I could grab that and send that to a collection of my choice. And let's see, if I go here, this is my UChicago self, and I say, well, that Nawrocki personal character's already done what I need him to do. I'm going to delete his access, remove his access there, and come over here and click. If I refresh this, it should say permission denied, right? Because I removed that access. Okay, so there's a sharing with an individual, but what I think is a little bit more compelling is that we also have the ability to create groups. And I created a Globus group the other day, and there should be, if I look on that, oops, not Globus Flows users, that's not what I want. Here's my group that I like to use for today. And I'm going to look at the settings of that group. Okay, so I've got a Globus group out there. And I've set it up so any Globus user can see it. So you can log into Globus right now and search on that group. And it's also going to give you membership to that group automatically if all policies are met. So here, I don't even approve your membership to the group. You could go to that group, join it, and you'll instantly be a member. Obviously, you can tie that down. You could have it so invitations, it's only available by invitation. You can have it so you can only send invitations and join it. You can have it so people can request access and then you approve their membership, but lots of different ways to set that group. And if I look here, nobody's joined my group. Okay, so I've created this group and anybody out there can go join it. And now if I go back to my file manager and my collections, where's my shareable by me? Here's my share for today. I can set permissions, so add permissions, share with a group, select my group. Here's my group for today. tie it down to that directory again, give them only read permissions, and add that permission. There we go. So now you can go in, join my group, you'll have access to my guest collection, be able to grab my slides, and transfer them to an endpoint of your choice. Okay, couple other things I'll show here. Let's go back to the file manager. You'll note here there's the download button. And I mentioned we do have the ability to add HTTPS access. Midway is not set up that way, so I can't set things up for HTTPS access. But some people come here and they go, well, download's grayed out, I can't do anything. No, you've got to create your own collection to download, to actually transfer data to. This is for HTTPS access. So don't be confused by those. So let's do a quick demo of, I'll do a quick installation of Globus Connect Personal so you can set up your own endpoint. And let's see, I'll go here to, I've got Globus Connect Personal running on my laptop. You see Greg's MacBook Pro GCP. I'm going to show you how to delete it first, because that's pretty important if you want Globus Connect Personal off your endpoint. The way to do that is you go into Preferences and delete Globus Connect Personal and exit. And delete and exit. There, Globus Connect Personal is now off my laptop. Don't try and do it any other way. Don't go looking for files and try and delete files. Delete it that way. You won't have a problem. Now, that said, I also like when I do that, I go into my collections and I delete it from the web app as well. So if I look in the administered by me, I'm going to see that Greg's MacBook Pro here somewhere. There it is. And you can see it's already red because the endpoint went away. But I'm actually going to go in here and delete that from the web app as well. So there. So it's gone. OK, so let's recreate that. Here's how you install Globus Connect Personal. If I go to, let's see, File Manager, Collections. Okay, I click on Get Globus Connect Personal here, and it's going to take me to the, you can download Globus Connect Personal. Obviously, I've got it here because I'm always running it anyhow. So, but that's where you'd go to start an endpoint. And go ahead and run that application. And it'll take a minute, and it should pop up here. Okay, so I'm going to log in. And what it's doing here is let's go back to Chicago. Going to make sure that I have, so that's the identity it wants me to use. And I need my multi-factor authentication again. Log in. Perfect. Okay, so it wanted me to authenticate again. It says, I'm going to use your identity to do these things, and I'm going to install Globus Connect Personal, and I'm going to say that's fine. Greg's MacBook Pro, just give it a label here. I'm going to allow that. It's asking for consents. So here it's going to ask me for a collection name. Again, let's just use that, Greg's MacBook Pro GCP. I can give it a description if I want. This high assurance box, I'll talk a little bit about high assurance subscriptions, but unless you know your organization has a high assurance subscription, don't click that because you'll just have to delete your endpoint and start all over. And let's go ahead and save that. And there we go. I should have created Globus Connect Personal. Setup successful, Greg's MacBook Pro GCP. I'm going to go ahead and delete that. And if I go back to, my file manager and I look for collections, if I look for administered by me, I should see Greg's MacBook Pro GCP. Click on that. I'm going to open it up in the file manager. And there we go. So there's my directory structure on my Mac. I can access just about any directory there and move stuff between that and any other Globus collection. If you want to tie that down to a different directory, you can. Up here, obviously your mileage may vary. If you're using Windows, it's done a little bit different. But if we go here to Preferences let's see, where is that? Access. I can tie that down to a different directory, and I sometimes do. If I add a directory, let's see, users, me. I've got a Globus endpoint directory that I like to set it to. There we go. I'm going to set it so I can write into it as well, but I'm going to go ahead and delete that. And there we go. So now, if I refresh this, I should only see that one Globus endpoint directory. Perfect. Okay, so really easy to install Globus Connect Personal. I usually tell people if it's taking you more than 30 seconds, you're probably doing something wrong. Okay, so we've seen transfer, we've seen sharing, we've seen groups, Globus Connect Personal. That is probably a pretty good, oh, one more thing I'll show you is roles on an endpoint. So that, let's see, if I go to collections and I go to my, where's my shareable by me? So here's that share that I created. I can set roles on this endpoint. So this is my guest collection that I want to be able to share out with people. Let's say this is something like I'm a PI and I've set this up and I want to be able to share data with people, but I'm going on vacation. So I want one of my grad students to be able to maintain this and to be able to give other people access to it. I can assign them a role. So I can give them an access manager role on this. So then they could go in and they could be able to grant access to other people. I could give them an administrator role so they could go in and actually delete it. Lower levels are the activity manager or activity monitor, so they can just check on it and make sure that things are going smoothly between it. But you can grant roles to others on endpoints, and this is, you know, the model. If you're in a large research group and working with lots of different people, you can create an endpoint and give other people access to it. Okay, so I think I've covered everything there. Any questions on what I just demoed? Okay, so I'll bring it home and hopefully we'll get to lunch. Oh, Globus sharing at the ALCF. I mentioned that you can't share from Theta, but you can share from Eagle. And it's a little bit different process than I just showed you, but it's very well documented, and it's well documented here. But if you just Google for ALCF Globus Eagle, you're going to find that web page and be able to learn all about how you can share data out using Eagle. Okay, the last thing I'll talk about is, or second to last thing, is we have some different subscription levels here. We have our standard subscription, but we also have our what we call our high assurance subscription, which has a BAA option as well. So this is for the case where you've got restricted data, right? You want a little bit more restriction on those endpoints. And you know, this is for handling PII, CUI, and PHI with our business associates agreement. So we follow the following NIST standards because that's what the University of Chicago does. So it fits to all those NIST type environments that you may have to maintain if you're doing PII or PHI information exchange. So there's a BAA with, you'd have to sign, or your organization would sign a BAA with us. And what that is, you're saying, but you never see our data, right? Why would we need a BAA with you? Well, that's put in place because we do see file and path names, and while not good practice, people can put PHI and file and path names, so we would see that, so hence the BAA. Okay, so what's in the box with a high assurance subscription? What do you get? You get this additional authentication assurance. Remember when I went to my endpoint or my collection there and it just let me right in because I was coming in with my UChicago ID or I had logged in previously with my ALCF account, so it just let me right into Midway and Theta. In this case, it doesn't. With high assurance, it says, yeah, no. I get that you think you're that person and Globus thinks you're that person, but I need to know at the collection level that you are that person. You must re-authenticate. There's also an expiration of your authentication. You know, we've all used our doctor's websites where you go in and it expires after 20 minutes and you've got to re-encrypt. Session and device isolation, so if you switch to a different browser, you've got to re-authenticate. Encryption is, of course, enforced. And also, there's some additional audit logging steps. Globus endpoints always log the transfers, but if you're a high assurance endpoint, we also do audit logging. And that's really, it tells you everything that's happening on that endpoint, who's creating collections, who's doing this, who's setting up that, who they're sharing with. So it gives you that additional audit logging that you need to, if you have to trace back. Okay. Last thing I'll talk about is building upon our platform services. So, there's one service, one Globus service, but many different ways to access it. We saw the web, we saw our timer service. I just kind of showed you that briefly. But we also have a command line interface, Globus flows, which I'll talk about in a minute, and also our REST API and the ability to use that in your own apps. So kind of our high-level Globus automation capabilities. The timer service, it's really Globus cron, right? You can set up transfers that are timed, based and timed and repetitive, and you can do that within the web service. There's also a separate command line interface that accesses that, so you can set it up. So we've got a command line interface, and I love the CLI. Our CLI is great because it's very scriptable. It's actually open source, so you can go to our GitHub and hack it up if you want to mess around with it. But you can, I love using it. I'm a shell scripter because I can never remember things and I'm lazy by nature. So I shell script everything, and the command line interface is great for that. You can roll it into all your shell scripting automation tasks. We've recently announced wide-scale availability of Globus flows. So Globus flows are a way that you can use, it's essentially a step function architecture that you can use what we call action providers in there. And this is something that's relatively new to us, and people are starting to use it. But it's a really slick way to do, I say drag and drop, it's not quite there yet, but it more or less is where you take these action providers and put them into a flow, right? A research automation flow that's really based on the AWS step functions. So it's a great way to do a little bit more high-level automation, take those flows and then make them available to others so they can run them. So if you've got a lab and you're doing data transfer from various instruments, you could set up a flow for that, and then other people could come in, access those flows, and do that exact same transfer steps. So pretty slick. Lastly, our API set. We've got our API set wrapped with a nice Python SDK. So we've got APIs for just about every bit of our services out there. Transfer's probably the most popular that you'd use. Really nice. It's standard resource named URL. It's standard REST approach. JSON's used for documents. It's the exact same API that the web app that I just showed you consumes. So it's not like we've got a special API and you've got to use another one. It's the exact same API out there, and it's very well documented. Like I said, we've got a Python SDK that wraps that. It's a client library that wraps that. It's nearly one-to-one correspondence with all the API functions, so it's pretty low level in and of itself. But it's got a couple of nice features. This transfer client class that manages the connection management, security, framing, marshaling of your data services. Again, very well documented. And the last thing I'll leave you with are URLs for various support resources out there. Docs.globus.org. It's a great site. There's a ton of docs there, a lot available. More information on the timer service can be found here. The command line interface, great web page there with a lot of examples of how to use the CLI. More on Globus flows can be gleaned there. We've got a YouTube channel with a lot of videos. If you're new to Globus and want to find out more, that's a great place to go too. If you want to dig in deeper and call yourself a developer and start messing around with the API and the SDK, documentation obviously available on our doc site. There's a lot on our GitHub site. The SDK itself is open source. I mentioned the command line interface is open source. There are Jupyter notebooks out there that do some demos of Globus and how it works, as well as some great automation examples for those common automation use cases with both shell scripts and Python modules. Okay, and I've got 5 minutes for questions. Okay.
What sort of limits are there in file sizes? Like, at some point, I need to hire a truck. Where is that point?
Yeah. No limits on file sizes. You can transfer as much as you want because we don't care, right? We're not storing it. I believe the largest transfer we did, I think a 3 petabyte transfer was one of the largest transfers that we've done, but there's been no limits, right? The limit's your time, right?
How long is it going to take? What about small files? Transferring a lot of small files.
Yeah, so, yeah, and there's always the what do we call it, the lots of small files problem, right? When you've got a ton of those small files in a directory, and we'll see that all the time. It's, why are my transfers taking forever? Well, you've got, 50 million files in a single directory, and they're all like, a couple of bytes in size. And that's problematic because, it makes a new connection for each one, and that takes a long time. So the key there is, right, tar it all up and then transfer it. So how do you do that? With automation, right? You can automate those tasks either with, something you write with the command line, the SDK, or even now with Globus flows. So we're starting to kind of encourage that. And the other problem there is like with tape archives, right? People trying to transfer that to a tape archive. Well, that is very problematic. So we do have tape archives. We have a messaging service where if somebody accesses the tape archive, the message pops up and says, yeah, don't do this. You want to tar this up before you transfer it.
Is underlying transfer in parallel?
Yeah, so a great question. So it depends on the endpoint, right? It depends on the hardware available behind the endpoint. There can be multiple nodes that service an endpoint. A lot of them are just single or dual node endpoints. I believe when Blue Water was running, there were 29 nodes behind that. So you could get a lot of parallelism there. And depending on the hardware, the processing power, you can kind of pull the parallelism and concurrency values for how many current files you can have in flight and how many parallel TCP streams you can have. Now, it's got to be shared between the endpoint. The other endpoint has to match that. But it takes the minimum of the endpoint to determine that.
But that's going to be, for example, controlled by configuration of the system admins, not by users specifically. For example, if you want to configure multiple cores or Globus transfer user does not have that.
Yeah, there are limits per user how many transfers they can have at a time.
So just to chime in, like at the ALCF, they have, I don't know the exact number, they have like a dozen or 20 UTN nodes, but they've set those up and you don't really get the control on how many of them you get. It's just set up a facility.
Okay. So you can set that.
No, you can't, is what I'm saying. It's automatic that it will select however many you're allowed to use.
Yeah.
It's done, the administrator of the endpoint can set that up. But there are Globus limits as well. We don't let, unlimited transfers per user because otherwise you can fire too many off.
Can I use wildcards on the Globus file manager to select like a subset of files?
You can select a subset of files in the file manager, to transfer.
Oh, no, but like, I mean, there are like, so if I'm going to transfer like a image plot file, I'll have like a large number of files. If I want to just send a subset of them, can I use some wildcards to like?
You can do that in the command line interface, but not in the web interface. The web interface is point and click, but the command line interface you can't. Yeah.
Does it preserve the timestamp information?
Yep. Mm-hmm. You saw that you could select that and say, I don't care when the file was transferred. I want to know when it was last touched. Yeah, you can preserve that. Okay, thanks.